You have a job. You can quit that job. You can demand a higher wage. You can own property, save money, build a life. These things feel so obvious you'd never think to question them. But for most of human history, none of that was true.
For most of European history, if you were born a peasant, you died a peasant. No exceptions, no escape. Just work, obey, and die on the land you were born on. And then something arrived in Europe that nobody asked for, and it destroyed everything.
But in destroying everything, it accidentally created something the world had never seen before: the middle class. This is how a plague built the world you live in. To understand what the Black Death actually did, you first have to understand the world it arrived in. It's the year 1300, Europe. The feudal system controls everything.
At the top, kings and lords. In the middle, knights and clergy. At the bottom, everyone else. About 90% of Europe's population were peasants. Serfs, specifically. A serf was not technically a slave.
But in practice, they couldn't leave their lord's land. They couldn't own property. They owed the lord a portion of everything they grew. They had no rights, no vote, no voice, and they had no way out. This system had worked, if you could call it that, for 500 years.
The lords owned the land, the church owned the souls, and the peasants owned nothing. Nobody thought this was going to change. And then it changed. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina, Sicily. The port officials who came to greet the ships made a horrible discovery. Most of the sailors were dead. The ones still alive were covered in black swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus. The port officials ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. It was too late. The plague had already come ashore.
What followed was the greatest catastrophe in human history, the Black Death. It spread through Europe like nothing before or since. Through fleas on rats, through the air, through touch. It didn't care if you were a peasant or a king. It didn't care if you were a priest or a child.
It moved from village to village, city to city, country to country, and it killed with terrifying speed. A person could feel fine in the morning and be dead by nightfall. By the time it was over, between 1347 and 1351, roughly 1/3 of all of Europe was dead.
1 in 3 people. In some cities it was worse. Florence lost 60% of its population in 18 months. Hamburg, half the population. Some villages were wiped out entirely. There were not enough living people to bury the dead.
Bodies piled in the streets. The church couldn't explain it. Doctors couldn't treat it. The rich fled cities to their country estates. But the plague followed them. And then, slowly, it ended.
Not because anyone stopped it. It just burned through everyone it could reach and ran out of people. By 1353, the worst was over. Europe stood in silence. And that silence was the most important moment in the history of labor. Here's why. Before the plague, lords had more serfs than they needed. Labor was the cheapest thing in Europe. There were always more peasants who needed work than there was work to give. If a serf complained, the lord shrugged. There were 10 more waiting to take their place. That was the entire secret to feudal power. Endless supply, zero leverage. And then 1/3 of the labor supply died. Overnight, the equation flipped. Lords still had fields, but they didn't have enough workers to farm them. For the first time in 500 years, the peasant had something the lord desperately needed: their labor. And for the first time, they knew it. Surviving peasants started walking off the land, to the next village, the next lord, demanding better wages, better conditions. The right to leave. Lords who refused lost their workers to lords who agreed. The market for labor was born. Not invented by a philosopher, not decreed by a king. Just ordinary people walking away from fields they'd been chained to for generations. The lords panicked.
They went to their kings. Do something, they said. The peasants are leaving. The kings tried. In England in 1351, King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers. It said wages must stay at pre-plague levels. Workers could not leave their home village.
Employers who paid more than the legal wage would be fined. It didn't work, because there weren't enough enforcers left either. The plague had killed the judges, the soldiers, the tax collectors. The system that kept the poor in place needed people to run it. And those people were gone. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the fields. The dead had left behind land, tools, livestock, entire farms with no one to claim them. Surviving peasants, for the first time in their lives, simply walked onto land and took it. Nobody came to stop them, because nobody was left to stop them. A peasant who had owned nothing in January 1347 might own a farm, tools, and animals by 1353. Not through revolution, not through charity, just through survival and opportunity. This was the birth of the yeoman farmer, a free peasant who owned their own land and tools, answerable to no lord, selling their crops on the open market, building wealth that could be passed to their children.
The concept of generational wealth, which today shapes everything from inheritance law to family businesses, was born in the fields left empty by the plague. But the transformation didn't stop in the fields. It spread into the cities, too. Before the plague, guilds controlled everything in cities. A guild was like a private club for craftsmen.
Weavers, bakers, blacksmiths, carpenters. To work in any trade in a city, you had to be in the guild. To get into the guild, you needed connections, time, and money, which meant the poor stayed poor and the guild family stayed rich. And then, the plague killed half the guild members. Suddenly, cities were desperate for skilled workers.
Guilds that had turned away apprentices for decades were now recruiting anyone who showed up. Young people who would never have been allowed near a guild workshop were suddenly learning skills that had been locked away for generations, skills they could own, skills that traveled with them wherever they went.
This was new. For the first time, your value wasn't determined by what land you were born on. It was determined by what you could do. A skilled blacksmith could walk into any city in Europe and find work. A skilled weaver could negotiate their own terms. This was the beginning of the professional class. People who weren't lords, weren't serfs, weren't clergy, just skilled people who sold their knowledge and their hands for pay. Sound familiar? That is you. You are the inheritor of a transformation that started in a plague. But there's one more chapter to this story.
And it's the most violent one. The lords didn't accept this transformation quietly. They tried everything. New laws, higher rents, force. But they couldn't put the genie back in the bottle because the peasants had learned something that couldn't be unlearned. They had learned that their labor had value.
And once a person learns that, they don't unlearn it. In 1381, 30 years after the plague, England exploded. The Peasants' Revolt. Tens of thousands of serfs marched on London, led by a man named Wat Tyler. They burned tax records,
Destroyed legal documents that bound them to the land, opened prisons, demanded an end to serfdom. The 14-year-old King Richard II rode out to meet them. He made promises. The revolt dispersed.
And then he broke every promise. Wat Tyler was killed. The leaders were executed. The revolt failed. Or did it? The leaders were dead, but the ideas weren't. Within 50 years of the revolt, serfdom in England was essentially over.
Not because the king wanted it to end, because the economics of labor had permanently shifted. Lords simply couldn't find workers willing to work for nothing anymore. The plague had done what no revolution could. It had permanently broken the arithmetic of oppression. And over the following century, something new grew from those broken fields.
Merchants, skilled craftsmen, independent farmers, people who were neither lords nor serfs, people who owned their own labor, their own tools, their own future. The middle class, born not from a good idea or a kind king, but from the most destructive event in European history. You wake up tomorrow and you can quit your job, demand a raise, own property, save money, build a life. You can do all of that because 1/3 of Europe died, and the survivors refused to go back to the world they'd been born into. Nobody planned this, nobody designed it. History just handed ordinary people an opening, and for the first time, they walked through it.